They didn't invite her to celebrate. They invited her to remember what she had lost. The chandelier-lit ballroom of the Astor Grand Hotel shimmered like a frozen ocean of gold, every crystal reflection sharpening the silence that followed her arrival. At precisely 7 p.m., the doors opened, and every conversation in the room fractured at once. She stepped in alone, wearing a simple black dress that carried no brand, no diamonds, only restraint. Heads turned not because she was expected, but because she was not. Somewhere near the center stage, her ex-husband stood surrounded by applause, his hand resting confidently on the arm of the woman everyone called his future. He smiled as if the past had already been erased. "You actually came," he said into the microphone, his voice amplified for the entire room, carrying the kind of casual cruelty that needed no shouting. A few guests laughed softly, uncertain if they were witnessing a joke or a verdict. She did not respond. Instead, her gaze moved slowly across the room, passing familiar faces who once called her kind, then difficult, then replaceable. A year ago, she had signed the papers without argument, leaving behind a marriage, a home, and the illusion that loyalty could be returned in kind. She remembered mornings spent arranging schedules that were never hers, evenings waiting for conversations that never arrived, and the quiet realization that love had become a language she was no longer being spoken to in. Yet now, standing beneath lights that made every truth harder to hide, she felt something unexpected settle within her: stillness. Not defeat, not anger, but clarity. The crowd expected tears, or pleading, or at least a visible fracture. Instead, she simply folded her hands in front of her, as if attending a meeting she had already decided to leave early. Her ex-husband leaned closer to the microphone again, performing for an audience that rewarded him with attention. "I hope you understand why things ended the way they did," he added, tone polished, rehearsed safe. But what he didn't see was the subtle shift in her expression, the way her eyes no longer searched for permission or approval. In that moment, something in her story quietly detached from him entirely. Behind her calm exterior, a different life had already begun taking shape in the months she had been absent from rooms like this, slow, deliberate, unseen. And though no one in the ballroom could know it yet, the woman they had gathered to witness in humiliation was not the same woman who had once been dismissed. She was simply waiting for the night to finish speaking before she began to act. In the quiet aftermath of that public humiliation, she did not run from the city that once applauded her pain. Instead, she learned its silence, waking up in a small apartment where morning light slipped through thin curtains like a reminder that time still moved forward regardless of heartbreak. Her hands no longer trembling with memory, but steady with intention as she searched for work that did not ask her to shrink herself. Taking on modest tasks in a local cafe where the smell of roasted coffee beans became her grounding ritual. Each cup she poured a quiet act of rebuilding, while outside the world continued its polished rhythm of status and appearances that no longer defined her worth. She learned to observe people differently now. Not by what they wore or who they claimed to be, but by how they treated those who could offer them nothing in return. And in that observation, she began to heal in ways that no apology could have achieved. Her ex-husband's world occasionally flickered across headlines and social conversations, a distant noise she no longer reached for, as if it belonged to another lifetime she had already outgrown. One afternoon, while restocking supplies at the cafe, she noticed a man who never quite fit the casual flow of the place. He did not demand attention, yet the room seemed to organize itself subtly around his presence. He spoke with calm precision, asking simple questions about the cafe's operations, never condescending, never revealing more than necessary. And when their eyes briefly met, there was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet curiosity that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, neither defined by her past nor measured by her loss. Over the following days he returned at irregular intervals, always alone, always observant, sometimes leaving small but meaningful advice about efficiency or structure that felt less like instruction and more like opportunity. She learned he was involved in business consulting, though he never emphasized titles or wealth. And in his presence, she found herself speaking more freely about her ideas she had buried during years of being told they were impractical. He listened in a way that made her feel intelligent rather than naive. And slowly the cafe became more than a place of work. It became a place of quiet reconstruction where she began sketching plans for something she had once abandoned. A concept for a space that blended service, dignity, and human connection. One evening, as the city lights softened into gold, he left a simple card on the counter without ceremony, offering access to resources and introductions if she ever chose to pursue something larger than her current circumstances. There was no pressure in his gesture, only possibility. And when she held that card in her hand, it did not feel like rescue. It felt like recognition, as if the world was finally acknowledging the version of her that had been waiting beneath the ruins of who she used to be. And for the first time since everything changed, she did not feel like someone recovering from a fall. She felt like someone quietly preparing to rise. The city felt different after that quiet exchange at the cafe, as if something invisible had shifted in the air around her life, not loudly and not suddenly, but with the steady pressure of change that cannot be ignored once it begins. She kept the card he left on the counter inside a plain notebook, not treating it like a promise of rescue, but like a key she was not yet ready to use. Days continued in disciplined rhythm. Early mornings at the cafe, steady hands, polite greetings, the familiar sound of cups meeting wooden counters. Yet behind her calm expression, there was a growing structure forming in her mind, a concept she could no longer dismiss. It was not just a business idea. It was a place built around dignity, where service workers were not invisible and customers were not measured by status, but by presence and respect. She began writing late at night in her small apartment, sketching layouts on paper, calculating costs in United States dollars, researching small commercial spaces within reasonable rent ranges in the city, her thinking sharper now, more focused, as if pain had removed unnecessary noise from her decisions. The man from the cafe did not intrude, but his presence remained consistent in subtle ways, occasionally leaving printed materials about small business structure, introductions to local advisors, or notes that contained only practical questions that made her think deeper rather than telling her what to do. Each interaction reinforced something she had almost forgotten, that intelligence does not need permission to exist. One afternoon, he asked if she would consider attending a private industry gathering, not as a guest of importance, but as an observer, a place where ideas and investors often crossed paths quietly away from public attention. She did not answer immediately, because part of her still associated such spaces with the world that had once judged her without hesitation. Yet another part of her understood that avoiding them would keep her small forever. She agreed without dramatic emotion, simply with a nod that felt heavier than it appeared. In the following days, she prepared not by changing who she was, but by refining what she already had, selecting simple professional clothing that reflected clarity rather than display, reviewing her notes until they felt like a second language, and studying names of people who shaped industries she had once considered unreachable. On the evening before the event, she stood by her apartment window watching city lights blur into motion, feeling neither fear nor confidence in excess, but a calm neutrality that often appears before transformation. When she arrived at the venue the next day, she moved through the space quietly, observing before participating, noticing how conversations formed like currents around influence and recognition. She remained composed, not seeking attention, not shrinking either, simply present in a way that no longer asked for validation. When the man from the cafe approached her inside that environment, dressed with understated precision that matched the setting without demanding attention, he did not introduce her to the room. He simply walked beside her, as if her presence there was already understood, and in that silent alignment, she began to sense that the version of her life that had once ended was not truly gone. It had only been waiting for her to become someone strong enough to continue it differently. Inside the private gathering, the atmosphere was not loud or chaotic, but controlled in a way that made every movement feel intentional, as if the room itself rewarded discipline over attention. She stayed close to the edge of conversations, not because she lacked confidence, but because she was learning the structure of influence before participating in it. People spoke in measured tones about investments, small business growth, and long-term development projects across United States markets, and she listened with a focus that felt different from anything in her past life, where she had once been present only to support someone else's ambitions. Now she was absorbing everything for herself, quietly connecting ideas that once seemed unrelated, noticing how value was not always in appearance, but in consistency and clarity of thought. The man who had guided her here remained nearby, never interrupting her focus, never positioning her as someone needing introduction, instead allowing her to move at her own pace, as if her presence required no justification. At one point, she overheard a discussion about funding opportunities for community-centered spaces, and something inside her tightened with recognition, because the idea she had been developing in her notebook suddenly felt less like a distant concept and more like something that could exist in the real world. She excused herself briefly, stepping toward a quieter corner where she could process what she was hearing, and for the first time in years, her thoughts were not dominated by survival or memory, but by construction. When she returned, a small group had formed near a table displaying simple materials about startup incubation programs, and without forcing her way in, she positioned herself within listening distance, absorbing details about application processes, mentorship structures, and early-stage funding expectations. The language was practical, not romantic, and that practicality made it feel reachable. Later, the man joined her again and asked a simple question about what she had noticed, not testing her, but inviting articulation, and she responded carefully, explaining how environments like this often excluded the very people who could benefit most from them, not through direct rejection, but through lack of access and confidence. He did not correct her or expand on her answer, only nodded as if her observation had confirmed something he already believed. As the evening continued, a subtle shift occurred when one of the attendees, a quiet investor involved in small urban development projects, expressed interest in hearing more about ideas that focused on service spaces designed around dignity and human interaction. The conversation was not dramatic. It unfolded slowly, like a door opening without sound, and she found herself speaking about her concept for the first time outside of her own notes, describing it in clear terms, focused on structure rather than emotion, while the room listened without interruption. There was no immediate promise, no sudden transformation, only attention, which in that environment carried its own weight. When the gathering began to wind down, she stepped outside for a moment, letting the cooler air settle around her thoughts, realizing that nothing in her external life had changed dramatically in that single evening. Yet internally, something irreversible had already begun, because she was no longer imagining a different life from a distance. She was standing inside the early framework of building it. The night after the gathering lingered in her mind like a quiet echo that refused to fade, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something subtle had shifted in the way she now perceived possibility itself. The next morning she returned to the cafe earlier than usual, moving through familiar routines with steady focus. Yet her thoughts were no longer confined to repetition, they were expanding outward, structured by what she had heard about development programs and early-stage funding conversations. When she opened her notebook behind the counter, the concept she had been shaping no longer felt like a private sketch. It felt like a draft of something that could be reviewed, challenged, and eventually built. Midday brought a message to her simple phone, not flashy or overwhelming, just a direct follow-up from one of the attendees she had spoken with briefly the night before, referencing her idea and requesting a more structured outline. She read it twice without changing her expression, then placed the phone down carefully as if any sudden movement might disrupt the reality of it. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening to the sounds of the cafe around her, the clink of cups, the low conversations, the rhythm of work continuing as if nothing had changed. Yet internally, she understood that something fundamental had already moved forward. Later that afternoon, the man who had been guiding her path appeared again, not announcing himself, not interrupting her flow, simply observing as she processed the message. He asked her if she felt ready to translate her idea into something more formal, something that could exist outside of notebooks and late-night thinking. She did not answer immediately, because readiness was no longer an emotional question for her. It was becoming a structural one, tied to discipline, clarity, and willingness to be seen. Instead, she asked a question about timing, about whether moving too early could dilute the idea, and he responded by saying that most ideas do not fail because they are early or late. They fail because they are never given shape outside the mind. That statement stayed with her long after he left. In the following days, she began refining everything with new precision, breaking her concept into components that could be explained in simple language, defining operational needs in United States dollars, estimating space requirements in square feet rather than abstract vision, and identifying the type of neighborhood that would align with her values. She met with the investor again in a smaller setting, this time not as an observer, but as someone presenting a direction. And while she spoke, she noticed something different in the room, not excitement, but attention that was sustained without interruption, the kind of attention that evaluates rather than entertains. There was no immediate agreement, no sudden commitment, only questions that tested clarity, sustainability, and purpose. She answered each one without rushing, realizing that she was no longer defending an idea born from pain. She was constructing a framework born from clarity. After the meeting ended, she stepped outside into the afternoon light, feeling the weight of what had just occurred not as pressure, but as alignment. For the first time, the life she had been quietly rebuilding was no longer isolated within her. It was beginning to intersect with systems that could carry it forward. And in that intersection, she understood something quietly powerful. That transformation was no longer an internal process. It was becoming a shared reality shaped through action, structure, and the steady decision to continue. The days that followed were no longer defined by uncertainty, but by structured momentum, as her concept gradually moved from early discussion into a more formal evaluation process that required clarity, documentation, and consistency in execution. She spent long hours refining every section of her proposal, translating vision into operational language, defining staffing needs, customer flow, and financial projections in United States dollars, making sure each detail could stand independently without relying on emotion or assumption. The cafe where she once only worked now felt like a temporary anchor between two versions of her life, one rooted in survival and the other beginning to form around intention. The man who had quietly guided her continued to appear at intervals that never disrupted her independence, offering perspective rather than direction, reminding her that progress is not measured by speed, but by stability under pressure. One afternoon, as she reviewed revisions with a focused calm, she received an envelope delivered to the cafe addressed in formal print, containing an invitation to a private corporate event hosted by a development network connected to several of the individuals she had met recently. The invitation was not decorative or exaggerated, but precise, listing location, time, and expected format of attendance, and it included names that carried weight in industries she was only beginning to understand from the inside. As she read it, her expression remained controlled, but her awareness sharpened, because among the listed attendees she recognized a name she had not seen in years, the same presence that belonged to a chapter of her life she had deliberately stopped revisiting. The memory did not arrive as emotion, but as distance, as if it belonged to someone she used to know rather than someone she still was. That evening she met with the man who had been supporting her progress, showing him the invitation without dramatic explanation. He reviewed it briefly, then asked her a simple question about whether she felt ready to be seen in a space where her past and her present might occupy the same room. She did not respond immediately, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that readiness was no longer about confidence or fear. It was about alignment between who she had become and what she was building. Over the following days, she prepared with quiet discipline, not transforming herself, but refining what was already consistent within her. She selected attire that reflected simplicity and control rather than display, reviewed her proposal until it could be spoken without hesitation, and mentally rehearsed the boundaries of what she would and would not allow herself to be defined by. The investor she had been meeting with expressed interest in accompanying her to the event in a professional capacity, not as support, but as acknowledgement that her work was now entering spaces where decisions were made in real time rather than in theory. She accepted without ceremony. On the morning of the event, she stood briefly by the window of her apartment, observing the steady movement of the city below, noticing how life continued regardless of personal transformation, and yet realizing that she was no longer observing from the margins. When she arrived at the venue that evening, the lighting was subdued, the conversations measured, and the atmosphere carried the quiet tension of influence and recognition intersecting in real time. She did not search the room, nor did she avoid it. She simply entered with a calm presence that no longer asked for permission. As she moved forward alongside those who now stood beside her professionally, she understood that this moment was not an ending or a confrontation, but the beginning of visibility, where everything she had rebuilt in silence was about to exist under light that could no longer be ignored. The evening air inside the venue carried a different weight now that she was no longer observing from distance, but standing within the current of attention itself, where every conversation seemed to recognize the quiet shift that had been building around her presence. She moved with controlled calm alongside the investor who accompanied her, exchanging brief acknowledgments with individuals who had only known her work through documents and early proposals, yet now saw her standing with the same composure as those who had long established their place in the room. There was no rush in her steps, no attempt to occupy space beyond what was necessary, only a steady alignment between intention and action that made her presence feel grounded rather than performative. As she approached one of the central discussion areas, the sound of conversation subtly changed, not stopping, but recalibrating, as if certain attention had begun to settle in her direction without announcement. It was in that moment she sensed a familiar tension in the atmosphere, not loud, not immediate, but recognizable in the way people unconsciously adjusted their posture when history entered the same space as the present. She did not turn first. She did not search for it. She simply became aware of it the way one becomes aware of temperature change in a room. Then she saw him. Her former husband stood within a group that appeared comfortable in its familiarity, speaking with confidence that carried the weight of past validation rather than present uncertainty. For a brief moment his expression did not change, as if the recognition of her required a recalibration that his current understanding of her had not prepared for. The space between them did not collapse or expand dramatically. It simply existed, filled with everything that had once been shared and everything that had since been lost. Around them, conversations continued, but the rhythm had shifted, as if the room itself understood that two timelines had intersected again. He spoke first, not with hostility, but with the measured tone of someone attempting to regain narrative control in a situation that no longer belonged to him. His words referenced the past in subtle fragments, phrased carefully enough to sound neutral while still attempting to reposition her within an older version of herself. She listened without interruption, her expression steady, her attention present but not reactive, allowing silence to exist where response was expected. That silence carried more weight than any explanation could have produced. The investor beside her remained composed, observing not the tension, but the structure of the interaction, as if evaluating not emotion but dynamics of perception. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and precise, not elevated, not defensive, simply clear in a way that did not invite negotiation of her identity. She acknowledged the past without attachment, as something that had shaped her but no longer defined her position in the present moment. There was no attempt to correct him, no effort to reclaim dignity through argument, only a quiet refusal to be interpreted through outdated frames. The conversation did not escalate because there was nothing to escalate against. What remained was only contrast between memory and continuity, between assumption and observable reality. As the exchange ended naturally without conclusion, she turned slightly toward the investor beside her and resumed the movement forward, not as retreat, but as continuation. Behind her, the space did not erupt or fracture. It simply returned to its rhythm, yet something within that rhythm had permanently adjusted. Her former husband remained where he was, not diminished in presence, but confronted with a version of her that no longer fit within the story he had preserved. She did not look back, not out of avoidance, but because the direction ahead no longer required permission from anything behind her. In that simple continuation, the imbalance of expectation shifted, not through confrontation, but through composure that no longer needed recognition to exist. The moment she resumed walking forward beside the investor, the room no longer felt like a stage of anticipation, but like a living system quietly recalibrating around a change that had already occurred, where conversations continued but attention had subtly shifted in direction of what had just been witnessed. She did not accelerate her pace, nor did she slow down, maintaining the same controlled rhythm as before, as if nothing external had altered her internal alignment. The investor beside her spoke briefly about next steps, about documentation and structured proposals. Yet his tone now carried a deeper recognition, as though what had just unfolded in the previous exchange had clarified not only her history, but also her position in the present landscape of influence. She responded with measured clarity, confirming timelines, refining expectations, and ensuring that every word remained anchored in practicality rather than emotion. In another part of the venue, her former husband remained within his circle, yet the energy surrounding him had shifted in ways that were not immediately visible but distinctly perceptible, as conversations that once flowed around him now required slight recalibration before continuing. He attempted to regain composure through engagement with others, yet his focus repeatedly returned to the direction she had moved, not because she had acted dramatically, but because she had not reacted at all. That absence of reaction became the central disruption. Over the following minutes, she engaged with several individuals connected to development funding and early-stage infrastructure support. Her responses precise, structured, and devoid of hesitation, each sentence building upon the last, as if she had already rehearsed not only the words but the reality behind them. There was no attempt to impress, only an insistence on clarity, and that clarity began to establish its own gravity within the space. The investor who accompanied her eventually introduced her formally to one of the senior partners overseeing regional expansion initiatives, and in that introduction there was no embellishment, only acknowledgement of work in progress that had already demonstrated sufficient structure to warrant attention. As she exchanged brief but substantive dialogue with this individual, she noticed how quickly the conversation shifted from curiosity to evaluation, and then to consideration, not because she was presenting herself as extraordinary, but because she was presenting something that could be built with precision. Meanwhile, across the room, her former husband observed from a distance that did not grant access but only perspective, realizing slowly that the version of her he had once defined no longer existed within any framework he could comfortably reference. There was no confrontation between them now, only asymmetry, one shaped by memory and assumption, the other shaped by iteration and execution. When she completed her conversation, she excused herself with the same composure she had maintained throughout the evening, stepping away not to escape attention, but to maintain focus on what was next. As she moved toward a quieter section of the venue, the investor informed her that preliminary interest had been expressed in reviewing a formal proposal within a structured timeline, contingent on documentation and feasibility alignment. She acknowledged this without visible reaction, yet internally recognized the significance not as validation, but as transition. For the first time, the concept she had once protected in private thought was beginning to exist within institutional consideration. Outside the main hall, she paused briefly near a large window overlooking the city, where lights stretched across distance like quiet signals of continuous motion, and in that reflection, she understood that what had begun as personal reconstruction had now entered a phase where it would be tested not by memory or emotion, but by structure, accountability, and the steady discipline of continuation. The night had fully settled over the city by the time she left the venue, but the world around her no longer felt like something separate from her direction. It felt aligned, as if every step she had taken since her quiet beginning had been moving toward this exact continuity. The investor walked beside her for a few moments before parting ways, confirming that the preliminary interest from the senior group would move into structured review within a defined timeline, and that she should prepare a complete operational draft within the coming days. She acknowledged this with the same calm precision she had maintained throughout the evening, not allowing urgency to distort clarity, because she understood that momentum built through structure was more sustainable than momentum built through emotion. As she stepped out into the cool air, she paused briefly near the curb, observing the movement of traffic and light reflections across the street. And in that silence, she realized there was no longer a separation between the idea she carried and the life she was living. They were beginning to converge into a single path of execution. Behind her, inside the venue, conversations continued, but her absence did not create disruption, only completion of a cycle that had already shifted focus elsewhere. Inside that same space, her former husband remained among his circle, But the energy around him had changed into something quieter, less certain, as if the narrative he had once relied upon no longer provided stable reference points for interpretation. He did not approach her again, not because distance had increased physically, but because distance had already been established through outcome rather than conflict. She entered the waiting car without hesitation, reviewing in her mind the next steps she would need to complete, not as abstract ambition, but as defined tasks involving documentation, financial structuring, and operational design in United States dollars and measurable units. The man who had supported her journey sent a brief message later that night, confirming that introductions would be formalized in writing and that she should prepare for a follow-up review session within the week. She read it once, then placed the phone aside, not because it lacked importance, but because importance no longer required emotional reaction to be recognized. Over the following days, her routine shifted from preparation to execution planning, as she worked through detailed frameworks that translated vision into structure, defining staffing models, space requirements in square feet, service flow design, and sustainability projections that could withstand formal scrutiny. Each layer she completed did not feel like creation from imagination, but refinement of something that had already begun to exist externally. She met again with the investor in a quiet office space during daylight hours, where discussions were no longer exploratory but procedural, focused on feasibility, scalability, and alignment with institutional expectations. Her responses remained steady and precise, and for the first time she noticed that she was no longer being evaluated as someone presenting an idea, but as someone shaping a project that already had momentum. Outside those meetings, her life remained simple and disciplined, returning to early mornings, structured planning sessions, and careful revision of every component before submission. Yet internally, something had fully settled, not excitement, not relief, but recognition that her life was no longer divided between what she had lost and what she might become. It had entered a phase where continuity replaced reflection, and every decision forward was no longer about healing the past, but about building something that would no longer require reference to it.